Thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight. Defence and intelligence reform hasn't attracted actually a great deal of invitations to speak, so I'm never sorry to actually get one, particularly to an audience as richly informed as this one. I have had the good fortune to have had quite a deal to do with defence and the ADF and the intelligence community in recent years. And it is on the basis of that set of experiences that I want to offer some reflections tonight. That association began when I led the McKinsey & Company consulting team that conducted the Defence Budget Review, or the PAPIS Review as it's also known, where we were examining the efficiency of Defence's operations. And the analysis we conducted fed the white paper on organisational issues and underpins major parts of the strategic reform programme. Although I note that McKinsey wasn't involved in the actual design of that programme. Then the year before last, I led the review into Defence's accountability and governance mechanisms for the Secretary and CDF, which was the first wholesale review of accountability and decision-making processes in the Defence organisation in recent times, though many other good reviews have touched on aspects of that question. The Minister subsequently made that report a major part of his reform efforts, accepting its recommendations in full, and on almost all aspects of it there is strong bipartisan support. And then last year I led with Rob Cornell, former Secretary of the Attorney General's Department, the independent review of the intelligence community. And that was a whole of intelligence community assessment that was looking at the effectiveness of the community since 9/11, and very importantly, taking a strategic look forward to ask how well prepared were we for the world that we face. In the course of all that work, I've had the opportunity to review much of Defence's operations, including spending time in Afghanistan and seeing the pointing end of the work that Defence and intelligence do. And in my journeys with Defence and the ADF and the intelligence community, I have to say I have had the privilege to meet some of the finest, most courageous, sharp-minded and decent people that you could ever want to meet. And so any commentary I make in lots of ways, it's always important to flag, it's not a commentary about people, it's about organisations. So based on that set of experiences, I want to set the scene by talking briefly about the national security challenges that I see Australia facing, and then about three unconventional defence capabilities that we need. One is organisational edge in our defence organisation. The second is innovation in our national security thinking and models. And the final is ethical policy leadership. I want to make the case that these are in fact defence capabilities and need to be considered alongside all of the hardware and people that go into making our defence capabilities. So just a word on Australia's defence reality, at least as I see it. And of course, there are lots of ways of describing it, but I think I owe you a description of at least at the highest level how I am inclined to interpret it. I'm aware it's not the interpretation necessarily of those who engage in this question from a vantage point, from other vantage points. It is from the vantage point of someone having spent a good deal of time in the world of management and ethical reflection. So make allowance for that when you hear how at least I think about it. The first of the things that I think about, and perhaps it's something that someone with an economist mindset is likely to do, is to think in economic terms. And at the level of states, it's very clear that our relative military power will decline significantly. In the near term, this is of course because of the rise of China and India, and on the longer horizon, it will be Indonesia, as 400 million people, and reasonable growth rates add another eye to the BRIC countries. Our relative decline, I think, will be in both absolute capability, but also in our traditional technological superiority, which will be challenged by the increasingly rapid innovation cycle of China. Here, I think we need to recognise that business and military models are of course deeply linked, and China's change in its business capabilities has profound implications for its military capabilities. And if you have observed the fast follower capabilities that China has demonstrated in many areas, and we have seen some of what that means in the military world, I think it will be an important dynamic. The other unpleasant reality of our region is that on its edges in North Asia and East Asia, nuclear proliferation continues. We are a major part of the world for that occurring, and all that goes with that plays out in our region. Relative power decline could be managed in a genteel way if we chose, and we don't often debate whether perhaps that is what we should do. I certainly don't think it is, but some countries have chosen that path. I think the reason it can't be is that there are plenty of plausible scenarios over the next 30 years for strategic flashpoints between major powers that would seriously affect our interests. Therefore, maintaining a distinctive military capability is important, and retaining an edge is vital. And as a trade-based nation, at a minimum, we need to be able to defend our sea lanes, offshore resources, our air routes, and at a maximum be able to make a meaningful contribution to an American-led coalition effort to ensure a rules-based international order prevails in our region. It's not only powerful states that we need to be prepared for, but also failing states. We have had to intervene in failing states in our neighbourhood already, and there's every reason to think that in the coming decade or so we will need to do so again. Then there are threats from non-state actors. Our borders will remain challenged by illegal migration. Whatever the policy responses, it will only be a matter of by how many. Terrorist threats, of course, remain real and regional, and we should not think that they will go away in a generation. And pirates are likely to continue to harass global shipping wherever there are failed states or lawless places near major trade routes. I want to highlight the importance of these issues because whatever might unfold between states, these non-state actors are the ones that are going to demand, and do demand today, our operational attention. And in the murky world where state and non-state actors are playing, there is a clear and present danger to our economic interests. Britain has been very clear in the work that it's done and made public about the billions of dollars worth of economic value that are being extracted every year from Britain by activity in the cyber world. And the United States last year, in one of the relatively few very public pieces of reports from their intelligence community, made it very clear that this is a major issue for the United States, and they were prepared to point to our regional friend China as a major threat in this area. So there's plenty on the public record about the magnitude and impact of the threats we face in the cyber world. And finally, framing all the other challenges, and this should be thought about as a national security challenge, is we have a constrained national budget. This is not just the GFC or GFC kind of Mark III version or Mark II, whichever we are up to, but a more fundamental issue of Australia's changing demographic profile. That means, as we know from the work that is well understood, that we will face significantly reduced growth in our tax base and greater calls for health and aged care services. I have to say that I think this is perhaps the greatest game changer in the security environment, and the one that I think the national security community has least come to terms with. There are many who still harbour the notion that when the storm clouds of global financial crises blow over, the world of expanding resources will return, or they believe that ultimately national security priorities will assert themselves over other competing claims. I think it's highly unlikely, and it's time we organised ourselves around the proposition that there will be, in relative terms, less resources for defence and security over the medium term, at a period when we are simultaneously undergoing relative decline in our capability against states, and see continuing, if not increasing, threats from non-state actors. That's the kind of reality, at least, as I would describe it. So therefore, some of the other kinds of capabilities that I think you need to deal with this kind of environment become important. The first one is what I would kind of describe as organisational edge. Where relative power is threatened and you face a constrained budget, you need to look for every source of advantage that you can achieve without extra monetary outlays. We are familiar enough with the military quest in these situations for asymmetric capabilities, for the capacity to increase for a given amount of resources, to demand both dramatically more offensive or defensive capabilities from those who we oppose. For anyone in our situation, militarily, our strategy must be fundamentally based on asymmetric capability. But it also means we need to look for that kind of asymmetric capability inside our organisations, to have what I would call organisational edge. And I think it comes in a number of forms. The first is high quality decision making is itself a strategic capability. And making the right decisions is not just about smart people. Many poor decisions have been made by sharp minds. For decisions of the scale and complexity of those made in the realm of defence in Australia, good decisions are about how well framed the question is, how well conducted the analysis is to inform those decisions, how well the possible options are developed, and how well they are tested, and whether the people with the right judgment are needed actually make the decisions when a decision has to be made. And I've been quite public in my reviews to say I think all of those conditions are currently compromised in our defence organisation. Secondly, efficiency is a capability in a constrained budget environment. That means the more efficient you are at creating capability, the more capability you can possess. And the SRP program, which in many ways I think still attacked just low-hanging fruit, saw a minimum of the $10 billion worth of efficiency that could be extracted from the largely current modes of operating in the defence organisation. That buys you at least a modest amount more capability, and dramatic and serious efficiency reform would buy a lot more. Organisational edge also comes in the form of speed. Time matters operationally, because if we are in conflicts, we need to be able to get battlefield priorities met, like improved force protection on a battlefield, not a bureaucratic timetable. Time matters strategically, because otherwise we can be left with capability gaps, such as we might end up having with our air power, or we end up with the need for expensive temporary measures to fill gaps. Organisational edge is also the capacity to avoid failure of organisational energy and to stay focused. Failures are organisationally distracting, and defence, unfortunately, has had a fair number of them. And they are, I think, distracting in a whole range of ways. And if we just think about them, we start to realise why eliminating substantial failures is so important. Organisational failures invite, often not inappropriately, inquiries. However, I think in recent times that has got out of control, and I say that as someone who was involved in one of them. At one point, about a year ago, there were 8 culture inquiries into defence going on simultaneously. Now that creates multiple problems. It leads to a tick list approach to reform, where you have long lists of things which you ask people to check off with, where it ends up where reform comes about complying, not about changing. It fragments into what should be integrated reform efforts. Organisational reform is not best done by recommendations about some aspect of an organisation that's failed, but by a well thought through overall agenda about the organisational capability that's required and how we get there. And managing these kind of issues consumes organisations' scarcest resource, which is leadership time. So I think we have a problem with the number of inquiries that we've had, and I bear this thought heavily because succeeding work that I've done at Defence has been a long series of extremely well thought through and written reports where, and I made the point in the accountability review, as I was cited the number of reviews that had recommended almost identical things to the things that were indeed still necessary. There had been no lack of analysis, there had been a lack of action, and in fact I think the force multiplier was the number of reviews. Second, failures are unquestionably reputationally damaging. Reputation matters. It matters in bureaucratic enterprise of getting one's priorities attended to. In government, it matters in time and organisational energy that's consumed persuading sceptical Treasury and Finance Department officials about what you're actually doing. It's not that scepticism in the past hasn't been well meant. You need to remember that for a considerable period, not so long ago, defence's accounts were qualified because they didn't actually accurately represent what the money was being spent on in the department. It's only in recent years, under a forceful CFO, that has changed. But that doesn't make the rest of government very easy to get along with if you've lost that kind of trust. And it also matters in the perhaps most vital task of attracting talented people to work in the organisation. We know that in the end of the day, talent matters if we're to make real organisational progress. And thirdly, failures are morally draining. Internally, failure drains morale and saps engagement. If we want a organisational edge in our defence organisations, we need a far more capable defence organisation. And that's not to say that our defence organisation doesn't have a lot of capability or that it compares poorly to others around the world. To the contrary, in lots of ways, it is a leading organisation looked at from the vantage point of other defence organisations in the way that it manages a whole range of issues. It's also an organisation that has produced one of the most capable pound-for-pound fighting forces in the world and sustained a high operational tempo with remarkable success for the best part of the decade. It's not that it can't do things well, it's just that in the environment we face, it has to do things at a whole nother level of performance. And in the three major reports that I have been involved in, what I and the people I've collaborated with have set out, and what our analysis has demonstrated, is what could be done to improve performance. Clearly this is not the place for a kind of detailed recitation of those conclusions, but rather let me highlight some of the key propositions that run through them. None of them are rocket science at all, and indeed if they were, I think there would be reason to be skeptical of them. They are in lots of ways organisation 101, but no less important for being, in fact, even more important for being so. The first of those kind of themes that you'll find running through all of the work that I've been involved in is that distinctive capability is best generated through services or agencies focusing on what they do best, and that their efforts need to be coordinated through a clear, simple, outcome-focused plan with strong accountabilities to the centre for delivering those agreed outcomes. I've called that a one defence principle. It's important to remember that just a few years ago, before we began this work, there was no corporate plan for defence, no one overall plan that said these are the things that are Defence's top priorities that they are going to do this year. There is no comparable organisation of that scale in Australia or in many places that lacked those kind of basic instruments of corporate coordination. More broadly, there needs to be a relentless focus and a relentless outcomes focus to ensure that resources and organisational efforts are devoted to agreed, well prioritised and concrete objectives. These might seem incredibly obvious and straightforward points, but the number of times that we found in all of that work vague, unspecified objectives was substantial. It's essential that decision makers have good quality, timely, actionable information, and that the costs associated with generating those outcomes are well understood. Information is needed to enable people to make good trade-off decisions about what they're going to spend those resources on. And agility and accountability is also, I think, requires decision making to be focused on individuals, not on committees. Some of you would know the kind of vast number of committees that we publicly cited have run defence to date, and that has diffused the ability to have that kind of accountability and agility. And good quality decisions requires very well contested alternatives, and that's one of the great needs, is a greater sense of contested alternatives in these decisions. So we also, I think, finally need a sense of accountability that starts with the question of why first and then goes on to questions of who, so that organisational learning can occur as rapidly as possible. As I say, many of these themes are commonplace in other organisational environments and can seem simple. They are simple, and they should be. Occam's razor applies to organisational effectiveness as much as to anything else. Always prefer the simplest solution that will provide the answer you're seeking. Organisational improvement can be a fashion industry, and as a former consultant, I should know that. It's critical with something as complex as defence that we avoid fashion industry prescriptions and find the simplest workable solutions. And importantly, everyone, I think, in the ADF and defence has a role to play because of the degree to which simplification is actually possible. So if that's one of the big themes we need, a second one is, and a second kind of capability we need, is innovation in our approaches to national security. In a time of rapid change, advantage goes to the most adaptable. And Australia, faced with national security growing challenges in a constrained budget environment, we need to find new approaches to respond to our situation. And I think that needs to come at multiple levels. The first, we need to be innovative at the level of policy architecture. And some of the recent innovations that I think are a positive sign in this direction may help explain the point. One of the quiet but most significant policy changes of this government has been to adopt the broadly British all hazards or all risks approach to national security. Under this approach, largely borrowed in its original conception from the commercial world, is to use a risk matrix like those in more corporate environments to help you determine national security risks that you face. Likelihood on one side, consequence on the other, where you actually plot out all of the different risks that you see in that profile, and then in a very structured way determine what level of response you should be giving against these kinds of risks. It's in fact a powerful tool for a fact-based way of focusing resources on those threats to national security where you can make the greatest difference to mitigating the risk. And we have a great need to be deciding which risks and on what fact base are we actually dealing with, and what resources would in fact change the level of risk that we face. Now, I think those kind of models need to be complemented by, if you like, the offensive side of those kind of equations, where we plot similar levels of likelihood and negative consequence, positive consequence, and risk for taking assertive actions. These types of frameworks, I think, produce a discipline about how resources are spent and an objectivity that is in fact often lacking in the way we think about all of the risks we face and how we deploy our full set of national security resources against them. The second thing that I think we need in terms of innovation in this space is what I might describe as innovation in the military business model. If I think of winning strategies in the business world, changing the business model is critical. Think of Apple and iTunes versus the record industry, Walmart versus the grocery store, low-cost airlines versus full-service incumbents in Europe. These kind of dramatic advantages come when people change the business model. Our danger, given if my description of our strategic circumstance is even vaguely right, our danger is that we largely buy the approaches and materials that belong to military business models of major powers, not of powers like ourselves. Now, I don't know the hardware well enough and wouldn't profess to propose what those kind of innovative business models should look like. What I don't see however, the quest for the sort of game-changing innovation that should be at the centre of national security thinking. If I look at a country like Israel, I see a lot more of that kind of thinking as they seek technologies and models of dealing with their security issues that are actually highly relevant to their threatened kind of small power, middle power status in their kind of world. Clearly, we don't want to borrow from Israel. Their strategic circumstances are profoundly different from ours. But their approach to innovation certainly has some things to recommend it, and the connection between their business thinking about innovation and their military thinking seems to me to have something to recommend it. Third, we need a greater range of well-developed ideas about how we approach the big strategic questions. that we have about both our region, how we deal with the United States and our allies. One of the challenges for Australia is I think you can count on one hand, might stretch to two, the number of major players in public national security and defence policy discussions. I admire all of their contributions, but I think innovation requires a vastly greater range and more vigorously contested ideas. We are all familiar with the principal authors of opinion pieces in this space, well informed as they are, that fill the pages of the Fairfax and Murdoch media. We need a wider set of voices if we are to push the boundaries and generate the kind of innovation we need. Innovation is ultimately a question of a total ecology, and right around our defence and security issues at the moment, the ecology does not have a lot of diversity in it. And we know that diverse ecologies are far healthier for producing greater levels of adaptation. And at the moment, I think it would be hard to make the case that we have a vibrant, innovative ecology around that environment. Now, the final strategic capability that I actually want to talk about is what I want to call ethical policy leadership. And some would say this would seem a rather odd thing to talk about as a strategic capability. The other two, you can sort of see the logic a little. Well, here I think it is actually even probably the most important, because fighting wars in democracies and within an international order that aspires at least to be rules-based is enabled or greatly aided by retaining public support at home and in the court of international opinion. The extent to which you are able to retain support is greatly aided by public, domestic and international opinion believing that a cause is just and legal. America's capacity to act in the world, I believe, has been compromised by its handling of the ethical dimensions of a range of its actions post 9/11. And similarly, I think Britain's degrees of strategic freedom have been curtailed by some of its involvement in those actions. And the decade following 9/11, we saw the problems of dealing with contemporary security threats and how the social consensus can easily be lost or break down, whether it's over waterboarding, rendition, detention in Guantanamo Bay, expanded surveillance powers, the doctrine of preemption. They read as a list of moral controversies of our time, and without clear ethical leadership, where strategic leadership preceded it, I think they undermined the standing of the US and the UK, and as I say, their ability to act. Now, it would be easy to see these kind of ethical problems as the result of the realist pressure for results, and the utilitarian means justifies the end logic that prevails in certain parts of security communities. However, while those forces no doubt play a role, I think the root cause is deeper and more enduring. The deeper problem is that legal regimes and their ethical frameworks that the ones that still regulate the international security environment were forged to solve the moral dilemmas of earlier strategic eras. What required regulation was states and superstate structures of nuclear armed blocks of East and West, and a world of conventional technologies. That's what the moral and legal frameworks were there to regulate. Now, that landscape has changed dramatically, and we now face a new series of problems, a new landscape that for which there are not settled frameworks. We face new actors, new technologies, new domains of action, and old strategies that look very different in our new world. And I want to touch on each of these to kind of make the point. And inevitably in doing this, I tend to lose my friends both in the kind of civil liberties world and also in the military world. But nevertheless, that suggests that there's some cause for debate here. So first of all, to non-state actors as the kind of new actors that we've really got to deal with. Now, the non-state actor challenge, and the reason it's not going to go away, is it's the product of the realities of power in our age. If you are going to challenge a state when that state has the power of the US and her allies, you can't do it head-on by state-on-state rules. You can only do it by distributed asymmetric means if you're to have any chance of success. And this means that you are not going to be a state actor anymore. You are neither going to be a criminal because the wrong you're seeking to do is not for some private gain, nor is it targeted to cause harm to some particular individual. The object of the action is not the individual, but the collective of the state. Now, to date, here in Australia, we've chosen to fight non-state actors by using the rules of state conflict or the rules of domestic policing, augmented by intelligence capability. Mostly, we have wisely steered clear of using language like war on terror, which applies an old paradigm to a new species of threat. We and others have had some great successes in this approach, and I also think the world has a lot to learn by the successes in our region. Perhaps Indonesia, we are worth paying attention to their ability to degrade a serious terrorist threat, largely using traditional courts, adherence to the rule of law and policing, albeit sometimes very robust, supported by intelligence. Now, while critics point to failed tactics and practices there, it would be to miss the point that the traditional approach can still work even in remarkably challenging situations. However, there are situations where non-state actors pose challenges that traditional ethical and legal frameworks don't handle well, even the more successful ones. And we need ways to manage all of those situations so they can be done within ethical frameworks and the rule of law, so we can retain appropriate levels of support and freedom of action as a result. Let me highlight just two situations where the traditional approaches fall short and new approaches are needed. The first is when terrorists are captured or come into detention by any other means, including, and I know this is controversial right now in Australia at the moment, when they might come as in some form of illegal migration. Now, at its most extreme, this is the Guantanamo Bay problem. And we run up against a very similar problem, and it's much cause of public debate at the moment, when a suspected member of a terrorist organisation is an irregular maritime arrival, and might also be someone who looks very like and could in fact fit refugee categories because they're in fear of their life in a homeland. Now, on the one hand, these are not criminals in any traditional sense, but neither are they prisoners of war, because this is arguably not best described as a war, and it certainly doesn't have a clear beginning, and it's unlikely to have a clear end. It fits neither the criminal nor the war paradigm. We need to turn to a different paradigm to deal with these kind of threats. And one place that we could look is, and we do look, and it's controversial, is to the notion of preventative detention for certain types of threats to society. We use these situations where a person's not because they've committed a crime, but because the threat they pose to society is sufficiently large, and we are sufficiently confident that that threat is real, that society has decided to prevent that threat occurring. This is not to be taking a criminal action against these people, and therefore it's a very different species of action in preserving justice in our community, if we accept that maintaining security is an aspect of justice, which I would certainly argue for. Now, where we do have such procedures, we wrap all sorts of significant and appropriately so judicial processes around them to prevent arbitrary detention. And of course, we only do these things reluctantly. But if the threat is real, then we, I think, do need to be ready to engage in it. And we certainly see and to engage in forms of intrusive surveillance. We are ready to see justice in the monitoring of sex offenders in the community where there is an ongoing threat where there's an ongoing risk of threat. We need to be ready to make sure we get the balance right between review, so that when those people lose their enthusiasm for hostile action, clearly they no longer represent a threat, they no longer represent a compromise to our conditions for justice, and they need to be released. I think we have serious work to do to get that balance right in terms of the ability to make sure those reviews are well done. Now, the other piece, which I think is profoundly challenging, is what is the appropriate way to think about the justice involved in killing people who present threats. Think of the US killing of one of its own citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki, in a drone strike in the Yemen. Now, this man was a serious threat to security. They clearly had found him and had a rare opportunity to stop that threat, and they did so with lethal force. Now we can't see, this clearly can't be some form of punishment because there's been no due process required, even if a death penalty could be just, and I certainly don't believe it can be. Neither can this be an act of war because this is one of your own citizens, and even if it was a foreign citizen, the target is a particular individual rather than a representative of a state. Now in just war thinking, which always seeks an analogy in domestic justice as its foundation, this seems to be the force needed to prevent a wrong being done. The analogy here is to policing action, not to judicial action. Now, while what's not analogous is this person isn't an immediate threat. However, I think the point of justification comes in the force of necessity, that this was the only option and only reasonable trade-off given the risks to those who are seeking to stop him. It is legitimate, I think, to weigh the risks to police or soldiers involved in actually preventing hostility. Clearly, Barack Obama had a very difficult call to make on this question in dealing with Osama bin Laden as to what the trade-off of risk was that was appropriate in actually deciding how to prosecute that. Again, I think the lack of moral clarity about what happened to Osama bin Laden is a severe problem, and the confusion between punishment and prevention that got tangled up in that showed the lack of moral clarity about what was actually going on in that situation. Now, we know in our system that we are prepared to see police use very powerful forms of force, even lethal force, to protect citizens. What's different here is that we made a plan to kill somebody in order to do that. It puts it into a different category. And again, is one of those territories that we need to consider very carefully. Australia could easily have to face being involved in those kind of actions, or even potentially to have to contemplate them ourselves, although we would have difficulties within our current legal framework doing anything like that. So we need to be ready for potentially some difficult moral dilemmas about whether we are prepared to engage in clear preventative detention, which we're already involved in, but we need moral clarity about how and why we do that and what its bounds are, and in the deliberate targeting of the deliberate killing of people as a prevention against security threats. These are the realities now in the non-state actor world, and we have neither legal or moral frameworks that handle these as securely as they should today. We also have new technologies. The one that I think causes moral disquiet around the world is the use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. Now, Australia, of course, doesn't have armed drones, though we do have unarmed ones. And it has caused, I think, a lot of moral disquiet, though not often well clarified moral disquiet about what might be wrong, what might be wrong with these kinds of weapons. It's sometimes asserted that they are indiscriminate. I think when you face the real choice about how they're used between trying to launch munitions from a fast jet or trying to launch them from a platform that's loitered for a long time, that can wait until somebody is separated from a group of people and can be used to only when you have a strong positive identification of that person, they are potentially a much more discriminate weapon. I don't think the objection lies there. Rather, I think the real problem lies with the issue of the fact that they are an asymmetric capability that pits economic capability against human lives. One of the greatest checks on ensuring that we achieve proportionality in war is that everybody has stakes of human life in the conflict. It's what actually enables a far better sense of proportionality in the risks that each side has to take in order to seek to pursue justice in a situation. I think the legitimate concern in the use of these kind of forms of military power is that equation fundamentally changes. And again, I make the case that they could be morally used, but only within a rather different set of ethical frameworks than we currently have today. Finally, I think the space that we also need to deal with is the cyber world. Now, clearly here we have a whole range of very challenging problems. The first, of course, is the nature of privacy, where if that domain is to be used for actually finding threats to us, then that space needs to be able to be well used. And ironically, I think here that one of the possibilities is that, in fact, the analysis of larger amounts of data enables the better protection of individual identities. This is an apparently contradictory situation, but in fact, good network analysis means that you only need to identify the particular person in a network who exhibits all the patterns of a problem. You don't need to know the identities of all the people in the network. However, you do need to know what the network looks like. And so in some ways, I think we need a more liberal approach to enabling looking at large sets of data, but very specific, but of course continue very specific permissions when we decide on a particular individual that those large data sets reveal. The other thing that I think we need to think a lot about in cyberspace is how we frame up what hostility means in cyberspace. Clearly, if we had somebody physically violate our territory, fly some sort of stealth helicopter or plane in, land on a building in Melbourne, take out of it some billions of dollars worth of economically valuable information and use it against us, we would very readily see that as a particularly hostile thing for somebody to do because of the physical penetration of our sovereignty. If all of that's done electronically, I think we intuitively recognise that there's a different kind of threat involved. It seems not at the same level as a physical threat, and yet we feel it's uncomfortably a very serious threat. We have not worked out exactly how to think about that kind of hostility, and we certainly need to if we are to take offensive action in relation to cyber threats. And as I mentioned at the start, the US and Britain have made it very clear that the level of threat is one of our greatest clear and present dangers to our national economic interests that we've got today. The other thing, clearly, the final of those things that I think we need to think freshly about are old strategies in our changed world. And the principal one that we need to deal with is the threat of weapons of mass destruction. Given this is unpopular territory because of all that went wrong in Iraq around that topic, but merely because all of that went wrong doesn't mean that we should shy away from it. We have a real challenge in that to deal with that security threat appropriately, sometimes preventative action is the only thing that actually represents an appropriate way to maintain a secure situation, and yet Article 2.4 of the UN Charter makes it very difficult to take that kind of preventive action, the kind of thing the Israelis did when they bombed the Iraq reactor. Most international lawyers would say that lay outside international law. Most Israelis would say it was a perfectly ethical thing to do. We have not resolved the ethics of those kind of preemptive strikes, and we in all probability will face that problem in dealing with Iran. We need to be very kind of morally clear about how and when we think the conditions are in place to engage in that kind of hostility. I think, and I would make a case for that kind of preemptive action and for a need to update international law to reflect our robust capability to deal with weapons of mass destruction, where that's the most plausible way of actually maintaining security. I think we need those good frameworks precisely because Iraq failed as badly as it did. I appreciate that's as much an intelligence failure as it was a legal failure. Now, I think for Australia there is importance here. We are involved in all of those issues that I've described in terms of the ethical dilemmas, and we are well placed, I think, to engage the international community on this agenda. I think Australia should be actively engaging in research and public policy debate around those kind of themes to lead international debate on these issues. We should be ones, because perhaps in some ways we have at least as much stake as anybody else in these issues, and a position from which to speak that is both experience-based and strategic, and a strategic necessity to it, to lead international debate around what the reforms should be in all of those areas. I think that kind of debate would increase our degrees of strategic freedom that we very much need to act in our region, and the ability to retain the kind of public confidence when we act that we do so both ethically and legally, which is vital for all security interests to be well served. So across looking at where our defence and security situation lie, I think our fundamental need is over the next couple of years not to be looking to questions of hardware, though some of them are pressing and demanding, but we will better solve those hardware questions that we face, purchase of submarines and other things, if in fact we have got our own defence organisation house in order, and if we have started to plan for the kind of, particularly as we're getting into a new white paper world, the kind of more innovative approaches to what Australia needs to maintain the kind of security that we've managed to have now for so long. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Black. I think your talk is likely to bring forth quite a number of questions. So, if you can give your name and any organisation you might belong to, make your questions brief, please. Yeah.
Jeffrey Babb, Dr. Black. Going back to the D-notices, I recall seeing one of the last issues of the D-notice. First on the issue was location of Vladimir Petrov, which the Nation Review revealed in about 1970-71 was the Royal Park Hospital. That was one of the D-notices. The other was the capabilities of Australia's naval ships, which you can find out by going to any public library looking up Jane's fighting ships. Now that's the D-notice, there's no rely on voluntary compliance. Now, it seems to me that the main thing you need to get into the Fairfax press especially is to tack the Lowy Institute or the Grattan Institute after your name. Now, journalistic friends of mine who quote the Lowy Institute biblically have no idea that Frank Lowy owns supermarkets. Now this is quite strange to me. How will public debate cope with an environment where there are literally, within 10 years, some niche publications, but virtually no newspapers left, and virtually all knowledge will be on the web? How will that change public debate?
That's certainly a broad question. But I think the importance of it seems a couple of things are important in that. One, clearly public debate also occurs in the kind of blogosphere and in the kind of new media spaces, and it's not to be discounted for it, although it often lacks the kind of depth of analysis and everything else that you'd want it to have. I think we have a real demand in Australia to make sure that we do continue to try and sustain as plural a press as possible, and mostly because the front page matters. What matters is that we actually have a limited number of front pages that set an agenda for the rest of the media cycle, so that we can sustain a broad discussion by people on some topic for a sustained enough period of time that the public's opinion can move and that politicians can attend to it. So I think it ultimately lies on a kind of making sure we have a framework that leads to, and that does, I think, media is one of the areas where regulation does actually produce better competition. Italy's radically deregulated media market produced one owner, Silvio Berlusconi. So I do think we need a well-regulated market to ensure we have a competitive set of front pages, supported by whatever other goes on in the blogosphere around that, and drives the other media cycles. So I think there's a space for government here.
Okay, Frank.
Frank Mahler. Several years ago, we visited Costa Rica. While we were there, it was described to us where they had totally demilitarized. And I look at Australia, where we are not under attack, where we have never been under attack, and indeed the one time where we were under attack was with Japan, and if they really had put their efforts in, all our defense would have been useless. So I wonder, the whole framework that is set up for defence of Australia and what is going on. Yes, we need to protect our sea lanes for trade. Yes, we need a Coast Guard to patrol our waters. But beyond that, what are we doing?
I'll give you kind of run through the list of threats that I see as very real. Certainly we need them. Just protecting our sea lanes occupies a very large, enormous amount of naval capability just to do that in our offshore facilities. We do have states that are likely to fail in our region. That does require a non-trivial amount of capability. No one else is going to come and sort that out. And that does require a non-trivial amount of military capability to lift the number of troops that are required to restore some kind of modicum of order and enable a transition back to democracy in those places.
You assume that's Australia's responsibility?
I don't think it's anyone else's responsibility. No one else is going to turn up. So I think that's important. And our mere capacity to turn up, I think, also actually contributes to regional stability. So I think they're very real. We do need to maintain a robust capability against terrorist threats. They are clear, present, real dangers. If we weren't as robust as we are, I mean, we have a good number of people in prison already in Australia for, well proven in public courts plots to kill Australians. Those threats will keep coming. That at least argues for a very robust intelligence capability. And then the more challenging kind of set of questions. So all of that argues for a fairly substantial set of military capabilities just on, if you get the risk matrix out, that's why I'm quite in favour of risk matrices, you do get things that sit in the relatively high likelihood and pretty significant consequence for country categories. We've got enough in that box, more than many countries have in that box, given the nature of our environment. Then I think the question becomes, where do we fit into the US world? And clearly that's a debate that we have not, I think is still in a sense a kind of unresolved debate. Hugh White, I think, did a fantastic job kind of trying to poke us into having a better public debate about where we fit in. Because if we are seriously a US partner and we seriously expect to be involved in the US's efforts to maintain a rule-based international order in our region, and clearly they've signalled a desire to do that, you can't free ride on that. I don't think you morally free ride in it. I don't think you can practically free ride on it. And if we're going to do that, then that all argues for maintaining a level of capability that would enable us to at least be a contributor. And we'll never be more than that. But we are a valuable contributor with some of our niche capabilities to American operations. And while I think the scenarios on that kind of risk matrix around serious, really dramatic problems in our region probably edge a little more towards the less likely than the certain, there's enough there, given the consequences of it going wrong, that any rational calculation would say we need a pretty reasonable hedge against that. And that's where I think we add the last chunk of capability, which is our ability to partner with the US in maintaining a rules-based international order in our region. So that's the way I would think about it.
Zara.
Zara Kimpton from the AIIA. I just couldn't help thinking about the effects of 9/11 and whether it would be a very different world if it had never happened. One of the things that seems to be an awful lot of expense is going on the sort of security we have at airports. There are all these people testing you for explosives, which just seems to be a ridiculous waste of expense in Australia, where it's very unlikely that this would happen. How likely do you think there is that there would be another thing like 9/11? How much is all the community, the intelligence community, is it being effective enough to stop something like that happening? Do you feel confident?
Well, let's kind of deal with the different parts of that question. Are there people around the world trying to plot current 9/11 activities on publicly available information? Clearly so. We have some very troubling things going on in the Yemen, that's very public. Those printer cartridge bombs were incredibly sophisticated. The chemicals involved in those would have got through the sniffer things at the airport. Those sniffer things at the airport, they're nearly undetectable. that was a very clever plot, which failed. It reveals a high level of capability at both making extremely high impact explosive and concealing them very, very effectively. That's why, that is one of a range of reasons why, the international security community is genuinely worried. We've clearly had, we've got public reports around the, intervention by the Saudi agent to deal with what clearly was an attempt at another set of plane attacks. All of the evidence is these people are still interested in doing spectacular attacks. So is there both intent and capability out there? Quite clearly so. Does it target Australia? Well, if you read, if you kind of see what Al-Qaeda sends to its friends, one of the most enlightening things that I've kind of read in recent times is their Inspire magazine, which is, truly it's something they distribute on the web. It's distributed to young jihadis in Australia. It's a very sophisticated piece of modern media communication designed to inspire some very creative ways of killing people, bluntly. And we know from these kind of magazines and from their kind of media strategies we've seen that not only do they want to plot spectaculars, but they want to inspire very hard to detect individuals to take matters into, or very small groups of people to take matters into their own hands. And the security community will readily tell you that's the hardest bit to find, because, particularly in big communities, these people can progress things a very long way before, if you ever find out about them. So, Madrid kind of bombings, things like that, London bombings, I see no reason to think that there won't continue to be, just on what we publicly know, serious continued attempts at those kind of activities in a range of Western countries, and therefore we need to be very ready to deal with and intercept those threats.
Yep, Julian.
Julian Reeves. You've talked a lot about China and a lot about cyber warfare. Do you have an opinion on the advice that the Australian government's had on limiting purchase of communications equipment from China, and the significance of that policy?
What kind of comment are you after?
Huawei.
Huawei, yeah.
Whether your opinion on the credibility and seriousness of the advice to the government to limit Australia purchasing communications equipment from China?
Pretty limited amount I can say about that. It's certainly a matter that people have debated around. The purchase of Huawei equipment put at the core of networks have clearly been a matter that has been debated, and people have come to different conclusions about around the world as to whether or not that's a sort of wise or otherwise thing to do. At the end of the day, the government has to rely on very specific information briefed to them. Certainly, given the deliberations other countries have made on this question, it wouldn't suggest Australia's radically out of step with other people, and even those who may have Huawei equipment have only done it with some very intrusive requirements attached to it. At least how other countries have responded would give you reason to think that Australia's government hasn't been irrational in doing it.
Michael.
Michael Helton, council member. A Chinese general, I don't know his name, very recently said to the foreign minister, discussing the stationing of Marines in Darwin, and I know, having recently been to Darwin, they expect a hell of a lot more than actually currently coming. They're actually building up a capacity for them. Said that Australia needs to choose their godfather, which I presume was the translated word, America or China. Now, that sent a bit of a chill down my spine. I don't know what that means. I really have no idea. Can you provide any elaboration of what you understand that means?
Well, interpreting Chinese things in a year like this is a tricky business. I mean, I'm no sinologist, and I think to properly interpret those kind of observations requires very careful understanding of who it's speaking, to what audience they're speaking, on what agenda they're pursuing. And so I think any comment like that has to be read alongside the whole range of other comments that a lot of other players in China make, many of which are not as dramatically polarising as those comments. That said, however, Australia does, I think we could be more deft in the way we manage this, and it was certainly unfortunate to come back to the Huawei decision. To make the Huawei decision and the US basing decision all becoming public within a very short space of time wouldn't strike me as the wisest diplomatic model for communicating to China that we are profound friends with a range of other friends. And that we are committed to certain, and that our relationships do commit us to certain kinds of values, which we ultimately have to believe, if we've got a coherent foreign policy, can fit together. We ultimately have to be able to communicate to our partners that we can work with both around a commonly understood set of values.
Okay, yeah. Oh,
Barry
sorry.
Fox. I'd just like to ask you why you think we ought to be involved and on the ride with the Americans in their defence capabilities and explorations and so on around the world. Because it seems to me that recent years has exposed the Americans as a bankrupt, dangerous country. And it seems to me also that this terrorist problem about which you've spoken is to some extent the creation of the Americans themselves. It's the exercise of American foreign policy which has ultimately led to this. And by hooking our cart to the American horse, or joining the horse up to the American cart, it looks to me as if we're joining up with the wrong people. And it looks to me also as if the threat about which you've spoken would be minimised at the least if we abandon them. We can't do that because of our long association with the Americans, but it would be greatly reduced if we diminished our and just began distancing ourselves from them.
Sorry, can we?
Yeah, a very interesting set of important propositions there. Some of which I agree and some I don't agree with, and certainly some things I haven't said. Nothing I've said advocates Australia following the United States into whatever they're doing around the world by any means. We have a clearly defined set of interests that we need to work within, and America understands that, and we need to be careful around how we do that. So I don't think this is a case of following America wherever it goes. I think it does, however, say if we are serious about the rules-based international order in our region in this time, we have to deal with America. We have to decide where we stand in relation to American power in the region and make some kind of decision. And often we don't, as a middle power, we don't get to choose many of the rules of the game. And one of the rules in our region is America has decided that it will seek to play a major role in obviously maintaining its interests, but also maintaining an order in the region which is overwhelmingly in our advantage. A rules-based Asia, an international rules-based Asia that supports both trade and diplomacy on those terms is overwhelmingly in our advantage. Our question is, how do we deal with the United States creatively, constructively, as they seek to play that role? Fortunately, perhaps, we do have chips in the conversation thanks to turning up with America in various situations, which unquestionably make us a not unique but close to unique partner with them in our conversations. Hopefully one of the other things we use our chips in our conversations with them is in the way they choose to deal with the Islamic world. We have seen a substantial change under Obama about how they've started to think through doing that. Now, many may argue that there's a lot more they could do to engage with the Islamic world in a yet more sophisticated, constructive way, less likely to, be agents of the problems of their own making, which is, I think many would share your description that they contribute significantly to the problems that have come at them. So I think those things are all the case. One thing I think we need to be clear about, though, is if we were to distance ourselves from the United States, that would not mean we were no longer a terrorist target. Our being a terrorist target is as a result of our being a Western power. And if you read the Islamic narratives, which run a long way beyond just the extreme jihadist narratives, being a Western power is a major part of the problem. We don't just drop out of that by seeking to be very friendly to the United States. So I don't think those threats will go away. We may not like the world that we're faced to make some of these choices in, but I think Australia can make good choices in navigating that world.
Okay, I'm going to stretch friendship. Last question, Professor Edwards.
Peter Edwards. Thank you very much, Rufus. Just want to direct you particularly to the intelligence community on which you reported last year. One of the things that came out of the various reports on intelligence communities post 9/11, if you compare, for example, the 9/11 Commission with the flood report in Australia and subsequent ones, including your own, is that the Australian intelligence community seems to have come out of that experience in much better shape than the American one, and one could say much the same about the British as well. Why do you think that was? Is it personal or is it structural? Are there lessons to be learnt and perhaps even applied by Australia to our friends in Washington on these matters? And do you think that we would actually benefit from having more discussion and debate around intelligence communities, which is inhibited by the very high degree of secrecy that they themselves impose?
Yeah, really, really interesting questions. Let me take them kind of a couple of parts that are in there. The first one, why did our community overall do better? Remember, it did have one catastrophic failure, which was Bali. So there's one very catastrophic failure, from which I think they learnt the right lessons and learnt them quickly and dramatically, and the internal reforms that drove, a particular cultural nature, were significant. So we're not by no means, the scorecard is not clean, but it's pretty good. And there's always a measure of luck too. I mean, anyone will tell you there's always a measure of luck. So we've probably been a little bit lucky as well. But net, they've covered an awful lot of ground in a very short period of time. One of the things that unquestionably helps us is size. One of the enormous difficulties around the Americans is very large, very established, huge bureaucracies. We're actually getting the level of cooperation right, which has been at the core of 9/11 failures, was very difficult. In our public report, we've said we think the leadership of the intelligence organisations have their level of cooperation has improved dramatically and is in pretty good shape. I think that's made the world of difference. We have a number of fusion centres, which I think we've also noted work well. That have actually enabled us to combine those agencies' capabilities against particular targets. We have commented, the scorecard is not entirely clean, that at lower levels of these agencies there are still issues to do with the not unlike American kinds of the need for less suspicion, more cooperation. This is not a completely clean bill of health, but I think that senior cooperation has made a great deal of difference, and the way in which they work together has improved enormously and made a very real difference. And where it's been organisationally embodied, I think that's had considerable effect. So I think a number of those size related and leadership person related. If you also think we did some interesting things in terms of who we moved around as leaders. So we moved the head of ASIS to become the head of ASIO. Now that's a major thing to do in terms of building a different kind of collaborative set of arrangements. That's very atypical. The head of defence goes to become the head, who's sat across the defence intelligence organisations, moves to become the head of ASIS. So when you, I think, do those kind of leadership changes, you do produce quite different cultural outcomes of a very positive kind. So I think there's some things that are to be learnt from that, and indeed the way our defence intelligence organisations work, unlike America, sitting across all of them, we neatly had a single person, and that single person happened to be, I think, one of the most remarkable and capable public servants, of our time, who led reforms inside defence when Bali went wrong. So there are some very
Who was that?
unique.
Who was that?
Who was that?
You were talking about somebody who?
The guy that led to...
Oh, you're not going to name him?
Well, I think the modesty. Yeah, no, I'm not going to name him. No, I don't. I think, well, you know, I don't want to name him. It's publicly known. I think there is terrific. I think there are a series of forces that at work have made it very different. So I think those things all contribute. Now, should we be more public? Should they be more public? I think they've made some small steps, and probably it's good if we take a few more. Intelligence communities have come a long way in a relatively short time in becoming more public. A lot depends on how well the media handles it. Clearly the greatest fear inside the intelligence communities is, as they step out, do the media handle this well? Because these stories can be sensational and really, and that actually leads to a very unhealthy public debate. I hope little by little we're continuing on a path. We know a lot more, as we pointed out now, than we did back in the 70s. Hopefully that continues. The biggest constraint, in a sense, the biggest kind of thing I'm sorry about in our public report is it's so wretchedly thin. Now that's because we're so operational at the moment. You know, the final report to government and the agencies is a very fat volume. But if you think of all of the areas, the intelligence communities have gone from being basically supporting policy and running around chasing a few odd spies and other people to becoming incredibly operationally embedded. And that again makes it difficult to talk lots about their public roles, because they're day-to-day. You know, if you think about the amount of defence and total resource devoted just to Afghanistan alone, it's a very large portion of our intelligence work is, you know, supporting what's going on in Afghanistan, whether you like that or not. But virtually none of that you could make public because it would compromise the operations.